Jim, we were at the Traditional Britain Group conference yesterday, so if you can just give me, like, you know, some of the things that you took away from the various speeches there.
Well, the meeting started with a very forceful presentation by David Clues, who actually I've been interviewed by for Unity News a year or two ago. And he basically gave us a very good overview of the state of Scotland in particular, that it is essentially a wasteland at the present. The SNP policies, in particular on education, which used to be perhaps Scotland's most famous achievement. I mean, Scotland effectively ran the British Empire of the 19th century from the Governor-Generals down to the ship's engineer. These were largely Scots, and it was due to the fact that Scottish schools were significantly in advance of the rest of the UK. And the fact that the SNP have run this down bodes ill for the next generation of Scots. They simply won't have that advantage of an absolutely first-rate education, even in small schools in small towns, which was the greatest achievement of Scottish culture. David also pointed to the significance of Christianity. Going back to the Reformation, Scotland has always been more Protestant than England, people like John Knox and so on, and the two are interlinked, that the desire to study the Bible, the desire to have education right down to the lowest level of the village are integrated, and the destruction of Christianity and the destruction of the economic future of Scotland are far more interwoven than people would think. The theme of Christianity being under attack was taken up by Linda Rose, who is actually an Anglican vicar. And her point is that our whole civilization, going back to 1000 AD and even earlier, to 43 AD in fact, is built on Christianity. The interesting thing is that when people attack Christians for being bigoted and intolerant, the whole issue of tolerance is a result of Christianity. The people who are denigrating Christians for being, quote, narrow-minded and intolerant, those criticisms only make some sense because Christianity is imbued in us a sense of fairness and tolerance. If we were still Odinists, or if we'd become Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus or whatever, it's doubtful that discussion would take place. It isn't taking place in contemporary Islam or contemporary Hinduism, for instance. It is purely a Christian obsession with fairness towards your fellow man. And so to destroy Christianity, which is the root of it, is actually to call the whole question into doubt. Linda did not make the point, which I think is worth making, that Christianity is the only civilization which has abolished slavery purely on grounds of conscience. In other words, if you denigrate Christianity, you're denigrating the positive force which eliminated slavery, which doesn't exist in other civilizations. Islam is quite happy with slave trading. It still goes on, and Muhammad traded in slaves.
Well, they were into it way before we were.
All civilizations before our own Christian civilization took it for granted that some people have the right to dominate others and reduce them to slavery. Yeah. If they didn't reduce them to slavery, they'd probably have massacred them because they have no economic benefit. So there is a curious twist in the whole business of atheist intolerance of Christianity, in that it's like a snake eating its own tail, because without Christianity, the whole liberal debate would not exist. Yeah. As I say, those are two of the introductory papers.
And Jim, sorry, could we just go back to David Clues, because he was talking about Alex Salmond, wasn't he?
Yes, and ironically,
which was most odd.
He made the point that Alex Salmond was the last of the sort of trustworthy Scottish nationalist politicians before the clouds grew up over the behaviour of Sturgeon and her colleagues and the ghastly Humza Yousaf. But he made the point that Alex Salmond was somebody who did inspire trust and confidence from a wide range of Scottish opinion, and it was during the meeting that we learned that he just died. So it was rather ironic. In a sense, he gave him a funeral speech before he even knew that he was dead. But it shows what respect Salmond had, and the fact that there is no real replacement for him, a trustworthy Scottish nationalist whose views on the Union maybe controversial with those of us that are unionists, but you couldn't argue of having sort of malicious or ulterior motives. He was doing it on the grounds that it would be better for Scotland, in his opinion. Those were two of the papers, as I say, that were most interesting, and they were right at the beginning, David Clues and Linda Rose. And then there was a third one, which was rather more controversial, possibly the most controversial paper, which was Viscount's and David's. And his was a very forceful attack on the fact that the grooming scandal has still not been adequately resolved.
Well, it's actually still going on.
It's still going on.
Yeah, it's still
but
going
we know
on.
there were 1,400 victims in Rotherham alone. He estimated that probably 100,000 or more. How many people have been sent down for those crimes? Not many. Only a handful. And the complicity of the establishment in this is just as bad as the poison blood scandal, how haemophiliacs and other people were treated with blood which was known to be contaminated, which was bought from suspect sources in the United States. With the postmaster scandal, there's a whole succession of these. In each one, the government, the local authorities, the police, every authority you could think of, behaves in a disgraceful fashion, hoping that the problem will go away, that they can roll the can down the road, and that some other government will have to pay out the compensation which is due, or even investigate the problem in the first place and recognise it. And it's a sad reflection on the state of the establishment. One can't help thinking again of Linda Rose and David Clues. And is this because we have an atheistic establishment that frankly hasn't got any moral compass anymore? Yeah. It's not rooted in Christianity. Can you imagine Disraeli or Gladstone or any of the great figures of the 19th century subscribing to these sorts of attitudes, i.e., let's hope it'll become somebody else's problem and we don't have to pay out any money. In the end, the victims will die off of their own accord. All we have to do is outlast them and we don't have to shell out anything. That is so cynical.
Jim, it's not just, it's worse than losing Christianity. The establishment is now actively persecuting Christians, and they're the only ones that seem to be singled out for the special. You know, Muslims seem to just...
Nobody's going to arrest a Muslim street preacher for quoting from the Quran. But when people are told that they will lose their jobs if they wear a crucifix, when people are told that if they read from the Bible in public, they will be prosecuted, something very strange is going on. This is self-destruction. This is a culture destroying itself. It's a virus like AIDS, except it's a mental virus. This is the system attacking itself, and it's done for entirely selfish motives. That's what one of the other speakers brought out, is that this is not, whenever you hear that it's for the good of the public, you know that it's actually it's something bad is coming down the road. I can't remember who it was. It was something like Ralph Waldo Emerson or something who said, whenever a man comes towards you saying he's going to do something which is for your good, be very, very suspicious. And that is borne out. The establishment is always justifying itself by saying that it is for your benefit. Well, if it were for your benefit, you'd probably have thought of it for yourselves. It is when the establishment says it's doing you good, it's doing you harm. It's as simple as that, because the establishment cannot be trusted. It's got no moral compass. It is purely self-seeking.
Jim, there was also there were two AFD speakers, I believe. There was the serving member of the European Parliament. I can't remember his name, but
there was Herr Otten.
Yeah,
who spoke
I found
first.
that most interesting, because he was sort of saying, like, they've been democratically elected by the German people, but yet the other parties are colluding to actually keep them out.
But this is happening right across Europe.
It's happening all.
There is now a syndrome which is apparent in major Western European countries, which is the nationalist movement becomes the biggest single party. If anything can claim to be the voice of the people, it is the Nationalist Party. But it is denied power. That has happened several times in France, where Le Pen has been held off by an electoral system which is specifically designed by Mitterrand back in the 70s to keep the National Front from ever achieving power. That's why it occurs in two stages. They know that the National Front are going to do very well until they can persuade all the other parties to gang up against them. That's what's happening to the Alternative für Deutschland, to the Austrian Freedom Party, to Flams Belang. The only exceptions, paradoxically, are Sweden and Denmark, where the nationalists have been kept to a relatively low vote, though still a significant one, because the Social Democrats or whoever's in power, the left of centre governments, have simply wholesale adopted their policies. In other words, they're basically saying, we don't mind changing our principles as long as it keeps us in power and keeps the nationalists away from power. But we don't mind standing our principles on their heads if that's what the people want. Paradoxically, that is a form of democracy. It's not very fair to the nationalists, but if their principles are in effect being adopted, whether they like it or not, by the existing governments, then at least those changes are being made. And the interesting thing is that the concept of remigration, which we would have called repatriation, which was a policy of, for instance, voluntary repatriation, was a Tory policy for many decades through the 60s and 70s when I was growing up. That is now being spoken of again, because quite simply the numbers are too much for Western Europe to absorb and maintain its identity. Unless you want Europe to become Eurabia and semi-Muslim, which would change our entire culture, make it unrecognisable. It is not a coincidence that democracy and Christianity are strongly linked, because, as I say, it provides the preconditions without which a democracy is just a sham. We have so-called democracies in other parts of the world, but they don't function as democracies because the cultural attitudes are quite different. They're still winner takes all.
Well, thank you for your thoughts there, Jim, and I'm sure that our members will find your points there very interesting. And as I said, we look forward to the next conference next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much.